Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And tonight we'll be taking our subject a little bit far afield from our normal topics of current events in the news. Tonight we'll be talking about an intricate subject, labyrinths. And our guest tonight is Charlotte Wyncoop, who is an expert on the history and the current use of labyrinths. Charlotte, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Kevin. It's interesting to hear myself called an expert. I'll try to live up to it.
Well, let's test that expertise. And we'll go back a little bit into history. Labyrinths have been around for an awfully long time, correct?
When we're talking about the beginnings of labyrinths, it's probably easiest if I start with talking about the difference between a labyrinth and a maze, if you don't mind. For instance, when we're looking at a labyrinth, we're looking at something that's a very intricate pattern, and that's something that's very similar to a maze. Most people think of labyrinths and they think of mazes, but really a maze has multiple paths and a labyrinth has a single path. And the word maze actually developed in the 12th century.
And the idea of a maze is essentially to get lost and find the right path.
It's a puzzle for your brain.
Right, whereas a labyrinth
is a puzzle for your soul.
There's only one path through it, correct?
Right. So when you look at the word labyrinth, you're actually going back to ancient Minoan civilization. When I say ancient, I'm talking about Bronze Age Mediterranean Crete, you know. We're talking about the root of the word labyrinth. Labyrinthos is what the Greeks called it, but labyr is what the Minoans used. And it was the name of their double ceremonial acts. And so you go all the way back into labyrinth history and you start talking about Theseus and the Minotaur, and you go back into legends. And the reason we go back that far is we're going into oral history. Herodotus was the first person to start writing down what we would recognize as history.
Ultimately known as the father of history or the father of lies, depending on which person is reviewing him.
And that would be 5th century BC. And this stuff is back all the way from, 1500 BC up to maybe even 2500 BC. So you're really in the land of myths and legends and the dawn of big civilizations.
So what is the significance of a labyrinth, and why do they exist? I mean, it's because they've existed for so long, and you still see them today. I mean, I've seen them myself. As we go out west and you go to either religious areas or Western Indian tribal areas, I mean, the labyrinth is common. It seems to suffuse all cultures, crosses all cultural boundaries.
There's been labyrinths found, historical and archaeological labyrinths, found all through Europe, and that's usually associated with the Greeks and Western civilization. But you also go down into South Africa. The Zulu make mazes and labyrinths and stones, and it's a game. You go into the Southeast Asia and you start seeing these Greek-style labyrinths, even as far over as that. You go into China and they had incense burners and these single-path designs, very complex single-path designs. You go into South America and you see up in the mountains, there's these rock patterns that are reminiscent of labyrinths. You go over to southwestern United States and you get into the Indian tribes, and they have the man in the maze patterns, these labyrinth patterns. And you can't say that this is cultural contamination from the Greeks when you're getting over into North America and South America. Even though so much time's passed, you're really looking at a bunch of different cultures that came up with these ideas of using maze patterns in terms of looking at life, because our life is kind of like a maze. You get all these choices and stuff like that. But really, the labyrinth is the symbol of the true path through the maze. And so when you look at life and when you talk about it, we may have lots of paths that we can choose, but you only have one path you actually walk. So it really is more like a labyrinth.
So that brings me back to something you said earlier. We said where the maze is kind of a puzzle for the brain, but the labyrinth is an exercise for the soul.
Right.
And so if you walk a labyrinth, what does that do for your soul? What's happening there? Or what's the intended purpose?
Well, you've got some really interesting things going on when you start walking labyrinths. First of all, whether you're walking with your fingers, you're walking them just with your eyes, you're sitting there and you've got a pavement labyrinth or something like that you can walk on, you're engaging both your mind and your body simultaneously. And that's not something we do often in our culture. A lot of times we're going and doing something physical, or we're doing something mental. We're on the computer, or we're going out and playing sports. But it's not usually something that you're concentrating real hard on, both at the same time. And that's something that often is associated with music, where you get this concentration that's both physical and mental. So labyrinths have actually been research-wise associated a lot with the way we react to music as well. So when you're doing this, you're going through it and you're concentrating on the path. And because it's a single path, it's not something you're trying to figure out where you're going.
You just have to follow it.
You follow it.
Carefully.
Right. You focus on it. And it gets interesting there because you start seeing this get used like in schools with attention at deficit disorder. A lot of therapists will use it because it helps kids get to the point where they can actually focus long enough on something that's fun and interesting, and it helps develop the muscles to be able to do that.
The mental muscles.
The mental muscles to be able to do that. And because it's something that's engaging the physical at the same time, you don't have the squirreliness going on. You don't have the body interruptions. You know, a lot of people who use them for prayer, they'll sit there and they'll pray. You know, if they're sitting down and praying, they'll get fidgety eventually. You know, your body wants to move. But in a labyrinth, when you're walking it, or if you're sitting there doing it with your finger, you've engaged the body, and it's almost like because you've engaged it, you've kind of set it aside. And so your body's got something it's doing, so now your mind is free to do something else.
Now, something like this, and by the way, these are your creations, right?
Yes.
These labyrinths are ones that you've made. You're an artist, and this is
This
an
is
expression
what
of
I
your
do.
artwork, right? So this one that we're looking at here, this is a replica of what, the Cathedral of Chartres, was it? Or?
The Cathedral of Chartres in France. The Chartres Cathedral was built between 1100 and 1300 AD, obviously, and it's one of the premier Gothic cathedrals. I mean, it's really this gorgeous piece of architecture. And it's
I've seen it in photos many times.
It's amazing artistically. I'd love to be able to go there in person. I just sit there and look at the photos and go, oh. But this is actually the pattern, the labyrinth pattern set in the middle of, it's set in the middle of the cross. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the way the Gothic cathedrals were constructed, but they're always constructed on this cross pattern.
Right.
They've got naves on either side, the altar front and center. You know, your entrance is usually back here, so you're entering at the foot of the cross. This labyrinth actually sits in the center of, you know, these different patterns. And
so it's on the floor of the cathedral.
It's on the floor of the cathedral. It's inlaid into the center of the cathedral. And it's actually quite large. It's like 40 feet wide. And
something that you would be able to walk through,
yes, it's not something you trace with. It's something you sit there and walk. And they actually have it open for walking on a regular basis. And
now what surprises me is I think of labyrinths as being pre-Christian or even pagan, as when I was growing up in a Christian education, I think it wasn't Christian was by definition pagan, right? So I think of these as really being pagan symbols, and yet somehow they just flowed right into Christianity.
What Christianity loves to do, and you know, some people may disagree with me on this, but Paul, for instance, in his letter to the Romans, St. Paul, he said, "Look, here's this altar to the unknown God. Let me explain what this is about." Okay, when missionaries go to tribes, they go to places, they're looking for, you know, when the saints took their missionary journeys, what they looked for places where God was already at work. You know, within the Christian religion, we look at God as the creator. We look at him as being the one who made all of us. That presupposes that God is at work in all of us. You know, it's not that there's a select group. Yes, he has a mission for particular things. You know, Jesus had to be sent to a particular people as a person. But that doesn't mean he's not at work in the world at large. So what Paul was looking for was he was looking for these cultural touch points, these bridge points, where God was already at work in a culture, and he could say, hey, look, here's the God you know, and this is what he's doing. Let me show you, you know, where this makes this connection.
So he would make the connection between the gods of the local people, who were not necessarily Christian, with the Christian God.
Not so much the gods of the local people, but where God, the Creator, had already touched the culture.
Okay, and all right. And so he would explain, okay, you see this thing happening over here, you see this set of circumstances. This is the result of a creator. The creator, I, Paul, am describing to you.
Right,
right? Okay.
Right. He would sit there and explain these things. So for instance, when we're looking at this stuff, we're looking at, I'm going to use this as an example in this one. These are 7th Circuit Greek labyrinths.
Seven circuits?
7 circuits, meaning that there's 7 paths in there. So one,
Okay.
2,
I mean,
3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in the center.
Gotcha. Although there's one path. Once again, there's only one route.
There's
through
one
it.
route,
Yeah.
but there's 7 circles that make up this.
Got
Is an
it.
11 circle,
Got it.
to be a little clearer. So these were things that were in mosaics. They were all across the Roman Empire. And part of that was because the Romans had taken the story of Theseus and the Minotaur and adopted that. He was a superhero to them. You know, we know the stories of Batman, Spider-Man, you know, Superman. They knew Theseus and the Minotaur. That was a common story. When you look at the story of Theseus and the Minotaur, Theseus was the son of a king who volunteered to save his people from a terrible evil. He went into this labyrinth. He condemned himself to die by being shipped off as, you know, the sacrifice that was being demanded by the Minoans. And he was sacrificed to this.
Turned the tables on them in the end.
Right. He was sacrificed to this Minotaur that lived in this maze, in this labyrinth. And he fell in love when he was over there waiting for his turn with Ariadne, the king's daughter. And she gave him a thread to show him the way, because she knew the pattern, because it was her dancing grounds, which suggests that she was a priestess of their goddess worship. So she gave him the thread to be able to get through and kill the Minotaur. So Theseus faced his death, went into certain death, but emerged victorious from it, and then returned home with his love, having been led by this thread through this torturous path. Returned with his love to become king of Athens. What Christians saw in this story was they saw an allegory for Christ. They saw the son of a great king who volunteered to save his people from a terrible evil.
Volunteered to die in order to save his people.
Right. And so this very, very common story became a bridge of understanding for the Romans who'd not heard necessarily of Christ, not heard of this Jewish God. But they understood the story of Theseus, and they understood why a son would go to save his people.
So this is how it made the transition into Christianity.
So then you have this Roman Empire who becomes Christian, and then he turns around and says, okay, everybody in Rome is Christian. At that point, suddenly everybody's a Christian. Well, what's a Christian? And so they took this idea, and they absorbed this idea of Theseus and the Minotaur, and they understood this on a gut level in ways that we don't understand because of the culture and because of the time they lived in.
So let's jump to the present then and talk about how we understand labyrinths today and where they might fit in contemporary life. Where do we see these in use today, and how could we make use of them?
Well, what's fun is they've found a lot of acceptance in a lot of different ways, and most of it's based on this symbolism that's inherent in here. You know, this is kind of symbolism that, you know, whether it's the American Indians or, you know, whether it's, you know, over in, you know, Southeast Asia, it's symbolism that has been found from multiple cultures, and I think that's why it touches so many people now today too. It's almost like an archetype, you know, something that calls commonly to all people. This idea is that this symbolizes, this path symbolizes the way we search for God.
Even if you're not, even if you were an atheist or an agnostic, would it be
or the
similarly?
way you search for yourself, the way you search for who you're meant to be. Okay, if you're an agnostic or an atheist, but if you know, are a Christian, or if you're a person who's just seeking God, whatever you want to call yourself, you know, this is to some degree the search for who you were meant to be, and because, you know, as a Christian, you look at it as God created us. It's who were you created to be, and so it's a search for God and for your true self.
So how does that get accomplished? Let's say I were in the Chartres Cathedral and I were in this particular labyrinth and could walk it, what preparation would I need to do? How would I ensure that my walking of this would get me to the point in the center where I was more sure of who I was meant to be?
There's a lot of things we do that are very active. This, in a sense, is a contemplative exercise, or meditative exercise. It's something that's been a deeply Christian tradition that's kind of been drawn away from in, you know, later years. Most people think of meditation or contemplation in terms of Eastern mysticism and that. But this is something that is a very medieval, very innately Christian practice. And what you do is you start here, coming to the foot of the cross. And I'm going to speak about it as a Christian just because that's,
That's your background.
that's
right.
my background
Right.
and stuff, and it's the easiest way to kind of describe it. But it's true no matter how you're kind of coming towards us. You start here at the foot of the cross. The idea is that there are things in life that will always turn us back on ourselves. Whether it's our moral principles or whatever we believe about the universe, there are things that turn us around and into different people.
Turn us back on ourselves, is that good or bad? I mean, I could see...
Well, for instance, as a Christian, when we come in here, there's things that I may not like about myself. And understanding Christ, understanding God, understanding scriptures, the benefits of having friends around me who sit there and go, is this really who you want to be? That turns me back around. Now,
in a
it's
good
not
way.
that
It turns you back to re-examine.
Right. It makes me look at things a different way. There's other parts in this where you aren't stopped. You go forward and you move closer and you think that you're getting closer to who you really want to be. But so much of life is spent thinking you're right there, and then the next day you're way off in left field. And that's one of the innate symbolisms behind the labyrinth, is that the closer you get, the further away you have to travel in the path.
I notice in this particular labyrinth, as you trace along there, that it does give you the illusion that in a very short, almost direct line, you're just about there.
You almost have it.
You almost have it. But in fact, just looking at it, you realize you have the rest of it to go until you finally get there.
And what's beautiful about these patterns is it so often reflects your journey through life. You sit there thinking, oh, things are going so well.
I've got it figured out.
And then, poof, you're, halfway across life thinking, how did I get so far from where I intended to be? And the benefit of this is you're not sitting here thinking, well, this exactly matches this exactly matches this. As you're walking the path, you're stopping and you're taking time to think about life, to think about what's going on in your life. We are data-driven nowadays. We have so much stuff going on. There's these busy schedules and everything else. And we, as a culture, don't have a tendency to make space for turning all that data and all this schedule and everything else into meaning.
It's just constant activity. Go, 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 go.
Right. And with that constant activity, if you don't stop and process, at some point you're going to find yourself way out in left field. You're going to find yourself in a direction or a place you never meant to go. And it's just because you get tyrannized by the urgent. You get so caught up in what's going on. And so the beautiful thing about these labyrinths, and I think what people connect with so deeply, is that it gives you time spent walking through this, because it does take a while to walk through one of these. Time that's intended to spent processing it. For Christians, it's sacred space, place to meet with God, to make that connection between the physical world and the spiritual world.
So let me ask you then, let's assume that, never having walked this one myself, it took you 40 minutes to get to the center. And it's not a matter of rushing through or trying. I mean, taking time is part of the exercise. What do you think about on the way out? Now you're retracing your steps.
So here's where the Christian imagery gets really intense. Remember, this is a medieval labyrinth, so we are talking about Christians. When we go into this, we're bringing this outside world into the path of walking towards God. This is life. This is, the idea being that you meet with God here in the center. It's birth, recreation. When you get here, the idea is that you've taken everything and you've given it to God. And you said, hey, this is, just what's going on in life. When you're coming back out, the idea is that you've turned 180 degrees again, and you're looking at things from the opposite direction. When you turn yourself back on a path, it's interesting because you're not walking the same path, even if you physically look like you're walking the same path. When you turn back on a path, you see things from the other side. And so the Christian imagery is that now we want to walk back through this thinking about the things we've been thinking about, but trying to look at it from God's perspective.
I'm my own perspective going in, but once I've reached the center and reached that understanding, now I turn around and go back and re-examine the same path, but from the opposite perspective.
And the idea is that having brought all of your burdens, bringing everything that you want to talk with God, and this is just spent time talking with God and listening, because we don't do a real good job of listening in our culture.
I've noticed that.
We get in here, and when we come back out, the idea is that we're trying to take God's perspective back out into the world. You know, whatever different problems we're trying to address, whatever different things, we're trying to grab hold of the understanding that we've gotten here, the time spent processing. Whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian, time spent processing is precious. It gives meaning and understanding to what's going on in life. And when you walk back out into the world, I like to think about this. This is the lunations of the Chartres Cathedral, but to me they look like gears, and it reminds me of the gears of a clock. You know, this is the world, and this is our time crunch, and you know, you're back into your schedule and everything else.
I'm an avid bicyclist, and it looks to me like the chain ring on the front.
There we go.
Where spinning fast is the objective, but here it's really the opposite of that. It's to take your time and slow down.
But once you get back out here, you can go as fast as you need to. And to some degree, the labyrinth gives you permission to move through it fast if you need to or want to, or move through it slow. The idea is that you take whatever time you need to. It's just time that you've dedicated to thinking and spending time trying to listen to your heart and listen to what's going inside you.
So let me ask you, since you clearly have spent a lot of time studying this and know quite a bit about it, what prompted you to do that? What got you interested in the first place?
Well, so I was at this church plant, and we were trying to help plant this church in Yorkville, Illinois. And it was one of the early meetings.
A church plant is where you create a new church?
It's where you set up a church. This is probably about 7 years back. And the economy was booming, all these subdivisions were going in, and where there's lots of subdivisions, there's only so much capacity for people in churches, so you need another church, not to supplant anybody else, but just to have room and have people.
Of population,
right. So the pastor comes up to me and he's like, "Hey, have you ever thought about, or have you ever used a labyrinth in worship?" And sometimes the little voice in your head sits there and says things that no. It was sitting there going, "Worship? Worship what?"
Spoken like a true agnostic.
There we go. And so he sat there and he's like, "Yeah, labyrinths have been used in worship for 1,000 years and blah, blah, blah." And I was sitting there going, "Really?" Because I thought of, David Bowie, 1980s, Labyrinth movie, or Pan's Labyrinth. Those are the things that were going through my head, not Christian Labyrinth. What? So I got
that
into
sparked it that said, well, look, there's something here I don't understand.
I liked research. I like research, and so I started reading up on it and went, "Oh, this is cool." And then I love symbolism. I mean, can't tell that I'm into symbolism and stuff.
I would never guess that. No.
Yeah. So I started reading up on it, and I was like, "Oh, this is really neat." And then I started playing with it because this pattern is incredibly easy to make. It looks very complex, but this is something a 5-year-old can do. Really.
Okay, I'll take your word for it.
It is, and I almost wish I had brought a different sample just so I could show you. But if you move this line, I'd made it round, but if you shift this whole thing down here, you have a plus symbol. And then in each of these, you put this angle, okay? And you can kind of see it here. But each of these has an angle around the plus. And then after the angle, you put a single stone, okay? And here's the stone, there's the angle on the stone. And what you do is you sit there and you go to the top of your plus and you connect to the first spot you come to. Then you go to your next thing. This is the angle on this side, and you connect over here to the dot. And you go to the end of the angle. Oops, I'm sorry, there's the dot. Go to the dot on this side and you connect over to this arm of the angle. And it just goes around, and all you're doing is going from the top and connecting to the closest, starting on the left and connecting to the closest, starting on the left and connecting to the closest, and you get this.
So what do you get, you personally, what do you get from creating these labyrinths that you might not get from just walking them or tracing them?
What I've noticed is different people react different ways to labyrinths. Some people really like finger labyrinths. They like, they like sitting here with these and taking their finger and tracing them. And specifically for these.
This is also the Chartres, right? Same pattern.
This is the same pattern. So for instance, I put this in embroidery on cloth so that people could sit there and they could close their eyes and feel, and talk, to God and spend time that way.
So it's almost like the physical sensation of a rosary.
Right. Exactly. Some people really enjoy doing that. Some people can't connect with this and really like walking them.
Mm-hmm.
Some people like exploring different patterns. I love building them. When I go to a labyrinth, I like walking it, but when I'm sitting here putting the sand together and sitting here with the decoupage and going through, and because this is all, I hand paint the glue on and press these in. I mean, this is detail work.
Yes.
When I do this,
And these are perfect circles. Do you use a compass or?
In this case, I didn't have a compass big enough, and so I actually sat there and held a piece of string and created it using, you know.
An ersatz compass, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, but when I do that, I spend all the time talking with God. And so for me, building a labyrinth is that same process as walking a labyrinth is for some people.
This is the meditative part, you're building it.
Right. And I love creating new designs and finding new ways to try to communicate some of the essential ideas. And I put this one together specifically to kind of highlight some of these sharp pattern designs that are in here, but try to make it a little more easy for people to see right away, you know, in terms of that we understand, you know, in modern days.
So I realize this sounds like a trivial question, but it's not. Do you have I'll say a favorite, but I don't really mean like, oh, this is the coolest. But is there some sort of design, or is there some labyrinth that is most meaningful to you? And I always like to stump my guests, just so you know.
You've stumped me. You really have, because I'm sitting here looking at the designs I brought, and that's the Greek.
And by the way,
this is what I put up, by the way, over at the Renaissance fairs. So if people come to the Janesville or the Stronghold Renaissance fairs, it's May and October that they do those. You'll be able to walk a labyrinth and try it out yourself.
And even these, you know, what look like from a distance Christmas tree ornaments, but these are labyrinths as well, right, that you've created.
This is
this is your design, right?
That's my spirit design. This is a spirit labyrinth. And the idea I had was I was over in, I was in South Carolina and I was at the beach. And I was watching the way the water comes up and swirls around and swirls patterns into the sand. And I was thinking about how so many of these cultures, the Greeks and the Romans, were all around the Mediterranean, and how much of these patterns are based on these spiral, you know, architectures, and you know. And so it was like, okay, well, you know, I wanted my hand, okay, and then I was thinking about, you know, water, baptism, you know, where the Holy Spirit's described as a wind or the breath. And I was like, okay, water and wind, they have those same kind of swirling patterns. And so I started thinking, okay, well, this is my hand, and this is the spirit and the connecting thread, you know, the thread that Ariadne gave Theseus. And the idea being that as we reach up, we're swirled around in life, you know, as if by water or by the spirit.
By the wind,
yeah.
right.
Our souls are moved from place to place. You know, we're not something that's steady, rock solid. We have a tendency to go all over.
And is the fact that this is a sphere, is that also meaningful? I mean, most of these are two-dimensional. Here's a three-dimensional labyrinth.
This is a three-dimensional labyrinth, and I had this idea based on a Native American artifact.
And this will have to be quick, by the way. We only have about 30 seconds left. So,
okay,
yes.
So it was based on a Native American artifact, and it was labyrinth that was on a ball. And I was like, I like this, because then I can use my fingers, and it's movable, and it's also got that sense of, you know, this is the earth, you know, this is our lives, you know, and it's round.
And it's solid, and you can get your hands all the way around it, right?
Yeah, and I like balls. I've got 4 small children. I like balls.
Well, with that, we're out of time. So, Charlotte, thank you so much. I've learned a whole lot about labyrinths. I thought I knew something about them, but I know a whole lot more now. So
well, thank you for having me here. I had a lot of fun.
My pleasure. And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19, and you can see us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So until next time, thank you and good night.